What would you do if the whole town laughed at the one decision that would save your life? For Della Weatherby, a woman with nothing left but a dead father's debts and a stubbornness nobody had asked for, that decision looked like madness. It looked like throwing away her last $40 on 60 acres of flooded granite that even the county didn't want. It was the kind of choice that made grown men slap their knees at the auction house, and women pull their children a little closer, as if foolishness might be catching. But what that water was hiding, what it had been hiding for 15 silent years, would surface a truth that had been drowned on purpose. It would take everything Della had left to drag it back into the light. Settle in, because this is a story about the ground beneath our feet, and about how the things we call worthless are sometimes only waiting for someone brave enough to look twice. The stagecoach that carried Della Weatherby into Ironwood Flats arrived 3 hours behind schedule, caked in the pale dust of a road that hadn't seen decent rain in the better part of a year, and she stepped down from it into a town that did not so much as glance her way. That suited her fine. She had spent the better part of the last month learning how to be a woman nobody looked twice at, a widow's shawl of quiet invisibility she had wrapped around herself somewhere between Denver and the Kansas line, and she wore it now the same way she wore her traveling dress, out of necessity rather than choice. She was 26 years old, and in the space of a single hard year, she had buried both of her parents, sold the last of her mother's good china to pay a landlord who did not care that grief takes time a body doesn't always have, and watched her father waste down to something thin and haunted in a rented room that smelled of coal smoke and regret. He had not always been a broken man. She remembered him differently. From a childhood she rarely let herself dwell on, a big, laughing quarryman with granite dust permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles. A man who used to lift her onto his shoulders so she could see clear over the piled stone at whatever pit he was working that season. Something had happened to change him. Something in a town called Ironwood Flats, 15 years back, that he would never speak of except in the worst hours of his final illness, when the fever loosened whatever it was he'd spent a decade and a half holding shut. "They took everything from me out there, Della," he had rasped, gripping her wrist with a strength that frightened her, that last week before the end. "Took my good name and 3 men's lives and buried the truth of it under water so deep nobody'd ever think to look. You go back there for me. You go back and you look." She had promised him she would, the way a person promises anything to a dying father, without any real intention of following through. And then she had found the letter tucked inside his Bible 3 days after the funeral, and the promise had become something else entirely. Something she could not put down even if she'd wanted to. So she had come. $40, a satchel of clothes, and a folded, brittle letter that named a flooded granite pit on the eastern edge of a town she had never once set foot in. That was all she carried into Ironwood Flats. Then she arrived to find the county holding an auction of seized and abandoned properties that very same week, Quarry number 9 chief among them, dismissed in a single dry line of the auctioneer's ledger as unimproved, flooded, no reserve. She understood, the way a person understands the second half of a sentence they've been waiting their whole life to hear, that she had not come to this town by accident at all. The courthouse steps were crowded that morning with the usual business of a county auction: parcels of grazing land, a repossessed wagon, a small herd of scrub cattle, and Quarry number 9 came up last, near noon, when the crowd had thinned to those with nothing better to do than watch a piece of worthless ground fail to sell. Down came the gavel, a small, dry gunshot of a sound. "Sold, to the lady in the gray bonnet for $40 even." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd gathered on the courthouse steps of Ironwood Flats, laughter with teeth in it. Della Weatherby stood very still in the middle of that laughter, her chin up, her hands folded tight around the strap of her father's old satchel, and she did not let herself flinch. $40. It was every cent she had in the world, and she had just spent it on a hole in the ground. Quarry number 9 had not produced a single block of granite in 15 years. It sat on the eastern edge of town like a wound the land had never closed, a pit 200 feet across and God knew how deep, filled to its ragged lip with black, still water. Nothing grew near it. Nothing swam in it, or if it did, no one had ever seen the thing surface. The old-timers called it the drowned pit, and they said it the way a person says a name they'd rather not say twice. $40 for a swimming hole nobody swims in, someone called out, and the crowd laughed again. Bartholomew Crane did not laugh. He stood near the front, a tall man in a coat too fine for a town this small, his silver-handled cane resting against his polished boot, and he watched Della with an expression that had nothing playful in it at all. He had wanted that quarry. Everyone in Ironwood Flats knew Bartholomew Crane had wanted that quarry, had tried 3 times in the last 2 years to buy it quietly from the county before it ever reached auction, and each time the sale had somehow fallen through. Now a stranger, a woman, and a poor one at that, had walked in off the noon stage and outbid him by $5 in front of half the town. He did not offer his congratulations. He simply turned, his jaw tight as a fist, and walked back toward the bank that bore his name in gold letters across the window, and something in the set of his shoulders told Della this was not finished. It was not much of a victory to hold on to, but it was hers, and after the year she had endured, that counted for something. Della's father had been a quarryman once, before the drink and the debts took the strength out of his hands. He had died 3 months ago in a rented room in Denver, and the only thing of value he left behind was a single folded letter, brittle with age, that he had made her promise to read only after he was gone. She had read it 100 times since. It spoke of a granite pit east of a town called Ironwood Flats, of a partnership gone wrong, of a flood that had not been an accident, and of a debt someone in that town owed him that he had never lived long enough to collect. "It ain't much to leave you, Della girl," he had written, his hand shaking so badly by the end that the letters bled into each other. "But there's a truth buried out there, and truth's worth more than gold if a body's brave enough to dig for it." She had come to Ironwood Flats with that letter and $40, and now she had traded the money for the pit itself, and the crowd's laughter followed her all the way to the edge of town, where the water sat black and patient and gave nothing away. At the rim of Quarry number 9, she stood for a long time that first evening, the satchel heavy against her hip, the wind pushing loose strands of hair across her face. The water did not ripple. It did not so much as breathe. It simply lay there, holding its silence like a confession no one had ever worked up the nerve to make. It was, she thought, the loneliest piece of ground she had ever stood on. And it was hers. The general store in Ironwood Flats smelled of coffee, tobacco, and dry goods, and when Della stepped inside the next morning to buy flour and a length of rope, the conversation died the way it always does when the subject of it walks through the door. "You're the one bought the pit," the storekeeper said. He was not unkind about it, only plain, the way men are plain when they think a hard truth is doing you a favor. "I am." "Folks are saying you paid $40 for a grave." "People say a great many things," Della said, and set her coins on the counter. An old man sat near the stove in the corner, a prospector by the look of his cracked boots and the pan resting against his knee, sifting absently through a tin of nails as though his hands needed something to do even when his mind was elsewhere. He did not look up as he spoke. "Water that still ain't sleeping," he said. "It's waiting." Della turned. Waiting for what? The old man's eyes, pale as creek water, lifted to hers for just a moment. For somebody with the sand to ask it. Then he bent back to his nails and said nothing more, no matter how she pressed him, and the storekeeper only shook his head and told her not to mind old Ezra, that he'd been talking in riddles since before she was born. He worked that quarry back before the flood, though, the storekeeper added, lowering his voice as though the words themselves might carry weight enough to do damage. One of maybe 4 men left in this town who did. Rest of 'em either moved on or don't care to talk about it and can't say I blame 'em. Bad business. What happened out there? What did happen out there? The storekeeper's face shut like a door caught by a sudden draft, quick and final. Wall gave way. Spring nobody knew about came up under it in the night. Lost some good men, God rest them, and that's about the whole of what anybody around here cares to say on the subject, Mrs. Begging your pardon. Della paid for her flour and her rope and did not press further, though she noted on her way to the door that old Ezra's pale eyes had followed her the entire time, sharp as a hawk's despite the vacant, wandering way he'd let his voice drift only minutes before. He was not so lost in his own head as the storekeeper made him out to be. He watched her with the wary attention of a man waiting to see whether a particular kind of trouble had finally arrived in town, and whether it was the kind worth warning against or the kind worth quietly hoping for. She would come to understand in time that it had been the second kind all along. Flour and rope in hand, she walked back toward the quarry, the old man's words rattling around inside her like a stone in a boot, and she told herself it was nothing. The rambling of a sun-touched old-timer, same as any small town keeps one of. She would remember those words again before the week was out, with the weight of prophecy. Bartholomew Crane had not become the wealthiest man in Ironwood Flats by leaving things to chance, and the news that reached him within a day of the auction, that some penniless stranger off the noon stage had outbid him for Quarry number 9 by $5, in front of half the town, sat in his gut like a swallowed stone. He kept an office above the bank, a handsome room of dark wood and good leather that looked out over the whole of the main street, and he stood at its window that evening watching the lamps come up one by one in windows that all, in one fashion or another, belonged to him. The mortgage on the mercantile, the note on the livery, the generous loan that had built the new church, and the quieter, less generous arrangement that kept the sheriff's silence bought and paid for 12 months out of every year. Brick by careful brick he had built all of it, on ground he had believed, for 15 years, was sealed shut for good. "She's asking questions," Dutch Holloway said from the doorway, turning his hat slowly in his hands, a habit that always came over him when he wanted something and hadn't yet worked out how to ask for it. Talk to old Ezra, talk to the Reed boy too out at the quarry rim. Everyone in this territory asks questions, Mr. Holloway. Very few of them ever find answers worth the asking. Crane did not turn from the window. Keep an eye on her. Nothing more than that for now. A woman with $40 and a flooded hole in the ground is not a threat to a man in my position. But even as he said it, some old, careful part of him, the same part that had once stood on the rim of that quarry 15 years ago with a keg of black powder, and 3 men's lives weighing less on his conscience than he would ever admit to another living soul, knew that he was lying to himself, and knew, with the particular dread of a man who has buried something and spent a decade and a half praying it stays buried, that the ground out at Quarry number 9 had never once, in all those years, felt entirely settled beneath his feet. He was right to be uneasy. He simply did not yet understand how right. The cabin she'd been renting sat a quarter-mile from the quarry's edge, a leaning one-room structure with a roof that leaked in 3 places and a door that didn't latch properly, but it was hers for $6 a month, and it had a clear view of the water. That first week, she spent every daylight hour walking the quarry's rim. She studied the old winch towers left to rust at its edge, the collapsed cart tracks that vanished into the black water like a road to nowhere. 15 years ago, According to what little the townsfolk would say, the eastern wall of the quarry had given way in a single night, and the pit had flooded from some underground spring nobody had known was there. 3 men had been working the night shift. None of their bodies were ever found. One of those men, she would later learn, had a younger brother who still lived at the edge of town, in a cabin as quiet and closed off as a shut fist. His name was Jonas Reed, and the first time Della saw him, he was standing on the far rim of the quarry with a rifle slung over his shoulder, watching her the way a man watches a fire that's gotten too close to his barn. "You're trespassing," he said, when she raised a hand in greeting. "I own this land," Della called back. "Bought it fair at auction yesterday." Something moved behind his eyes, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it. "Then you bought yourself a grave." He turned and walked away before she could ask him what he meant, his long strides eating up the dry ground, and Della stood there with her hands still half raised, feeling the same cold weight the old man's words had left in her. Everyone in this town, it seemed, spoke of her quarry the way other people spoke of the dead. She was not, by nature, a woman who scared easily. Grief had burned that particular softness out of her over the last hard year, and what her father's letter had planted in her was not fear, but a low, steady curiosity that refused to be talked out of itself. If Bartholomew Crane had wanted this land badly enough to try buying it quietly 3 separate times, and if the whole town flinched at the mere mention of it, then Della Weatherby intended to find out why. In the second week, she began to study the water itself. It was dropping, not by much, an inch here, 2 inches there, more visible at the crumbling south wall where old drainage cuts had been carved into the stone generations ago for reasons no one now remembered. Ironwood Flats was deep in a dry summer, the worst drought the old-timers could recall, and every creek and stock pond for 20 miles was shrinking under the relentless sun. The quarry, fed by nothing but that hidden spring and years of rain that had stopped coming, was shrinking too. Della found the old sluice gate on the 3rd day of her search, buried under 15 years of silt and scrub grass at the quarry's northern edge, rusted almost solid but not quite. It had been built, she guessed, to control the water level during the mine's working years. A crude iron mechanism, it connected to a drainage channel that ran off toward a dry wash a half-mile east. She worked at that rusted wheel for 4 straight days, her palms blistering, her arms aching in a way they had never ached before, and on the 5th day, with a groan like something waking from a very long sleep, the gate gave. Water began slowly to run. It was not a flood. It was not even a stream, not at first. Only a thin, muddy trickle finding its way down the old channel, disappearing into the parched earth of the wash. But over the following days, as she kept the gate open and the relentless sun kept drinking at what remained, the black water in quarry number 9 began, inch by patient inch, to fall. And as it fell, it started giving up what it had swallowed. The first thing to surface was the broken spoke of a wagon wheel, jutting up from the shallows near the south wall like a bone through skin. Then, 2 days later, a section of collapsed rock face that had clearly not fallen naturally. The stone was cracked in a pattern too clean, too deliberate, the kind of break a man makes with a keg of black powder and a careful hand rather than the kind the earth makes on its own. Della stood at the water's edge with her boots sinking into the newly exposed mud and felt something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the morning chill. A flood that had not been an accident. Her father's words, and now here was the proof of them, rising slow and silent out of black water 15 years deep. She did not tell anyone in town what she was finding. She had learned enough of Ironwood Flats in 2 weeks to know that whatever secret this pit was keeping, more than a few of the town's respected citizens had a stake in keeping it drowned. But she told Jonas Reed. She found him again at the quarry's rim on a hot, windless afternoon, the water down another half foot since morning, And this time when she called out to him, she did not wait for permission before crossing to where he stood. "Your brother," she said. "He was one of the 3 men lost the night this flooded. His whole body went still, the way a deer goes still at the first snap of a twig. Who told you that? Nobody had to. The way this whole town looks at that water when they think I'm not watching, and the way you looked at me the day we met, you've been carrying something a long time, Mr. Reed." For a moment she thought he would simply walk away again, the way he had the first time. Instead, he looked past her, out at the shrinking black water, and something in his weathered face cracked open just slightly, like ground giving way under old, familiar weight. "Sam," he said quietly. "My brother's name was Sam. He was 22 years old and he worked that quarry 6 days a week to save enough to marry a girl in Prescott. They told us the wall gave way in the night. Told us there was a spring under it nobody knew about, and that was that. God rest their souls, and would the family kindly not make trouble about it. You didn't believe them. There wasn't a body to bury, and there was a bank account that got fatter that same season. Those 2 things sitting side by side never once sat right with me." He finally turned to look at her fully. "You're draining it." "I am." "Why?" "Because my father spent his last years trying to tell me a truth buried in this town, and he died before he could finish, and I intend to finish it for him." She held his gaze steady. "Will you help me, Mr. Reed, or will you stand on that rim and watch, same as you've been doing for 15 years? The silence stretched long enough that she thought she had misjudged him entirely. Then he unslung the rifle from his shoulder, checked it out of old habit, and slung it back. "Show me what you found," he said, and just like that, the wall between them came down. They worked the drainage together through the last week of that brutal summer, widening the old channel by hand when the original cut proved too narrow to keep pace with the falling water, and each morning brought some new piece of the pit's 15-year silence up into the light. A second wagon wheel, this one whole. A rusted strongbox, empty, its lock forced open long before the water ever claimed it. And then, on a morning so still the whole valley seemed to be holding its breath, the water dropped low enough to expose the mouth of what had once been a side tunnel, cut into the quarry's southern wall and long since collapsed. Not collapsed by accident. Collapsed, Della saw at once, by the same deliberate hand that had cracked the wall above it. "Somebody sealed this on purpose," Jonas said, running his palm along the fractured stone. "Same night the water came in, I'd wager. Sealed it and drowned it in the same breath." "Sealed what?" He didn't answer. He was already working at the rubble with his bare hands, and after a moment's hesitation, Della knelt beside him and did the same, the 2 of them clawing at broken stone in the mud while the sun climbed, and the last of the black water crept back, inch by grudging inch, from ground it had held hostage for a decade and a half. What would you do if the ground beneath your own feet had been lying to you your whole life? That is the question the people of Ironwood Flats did not yet know they were about to be asked. Let us know in the comments what you think that tunnel was hiding, and stay with us, because the truth Della and Jonas were about to uncover would prove far darker, and far more valuable, than either of them had dared imagine. The gap they finally opened was barely wide enough for a grown man to squeeze through sideways, the stale, mineral-cold air breathing out of it like a held breath finally released. Jonas went first, a lantern in one hand, and Della followed close behind, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. 30 feet down, the tunnel leveled into a chamber that the flood, mercifully, had never fully reached. A shelf of dry stone raised just above the old water line, untouched by 15 years of drowning. And on that shelf sat 6 wooden crates, and beside them, a leather satchel gone stiff with age, and beside that, arranged with a care that made Della's stomach turn, 3 sets of human remains. Jonas made a sound low in his throat, and Della reached for his arm without thinking, steadying them both. "Sam," he said, very quietly, and knelt beside the smallest of the three. They did not open the crates that day. Instead, they sat in that dry stone chamber, the lantern light flickering over bones that had waited 15 years to be found, the air thick with the mineral smell of stone that had never once felt sun on it. Jonas told her what he knew. Della told him what her father's letter had said. Between the two of them, slowly, a shape began to form, the shape of a truth that Ironwood Flats had built its prosperity on top of and never once looked down to see. The chamber itself told its own quiet story, for anyone who had spent a lifetime, as Jonas had, learning to read stone instead of just looking at it. The tool marks along the walls were old, predating even the quarry's working years, and the shelf of dry rock had clearly been used more than once, worn smooth in places by boots that had stood there long before this particular tragedy ever occurred. It was not a chamber built for murder. It was a chamber that had simply been convenient to one, the way honest, useful things so often are pressed into the service of dishonest men. Somebody built this shelf for storage, Jonas murmured, running the lantern light along a worn groove in the stone where rope had once been strung, over and over, wearing a channel into solid granite. Before ever it became a tomb. Della said nothing. She was looking at the smallest of the three sets of remains, at the faded scrap of blue calico still clinging stubbornly to a collarbone, and thinking of a young man 22 years old who had wanted nothing more from this life than enough saved wages to marry a girl in Prescott, and had instead been left to keep company with stolen gold in the dark for 15 silent years. It was, she thought, the cruelest kind of theft. There was not the gold, though that was cruel enough, but the years. The years Jonas had spent not knowing, the years her own father had spent broken and disbelieved. There was no ledger anywhere that could account for the true weight of what this quarry had taken, and no amount of recovered gold would ever balance it back out. But the truth, once it was finally dragged into daylight, could at least stop the debt from growing any larger. On a night as dark and cold as that one, Della understood that this would have to be enough. The crates, when they finally worked up the courage to force them open 2 days later, were half filled with raw granite ore of no particular value. A deliberate camouflage, Della realized, for what lay beneath it. Under the stone, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, were bars of gold, government-stamped, the kind that traveled under armed guard and never simply vanished without a very great deal of trouble being taken to make it look otherwise. And in the leather satchel, wrapped in the same oilcloth, were ledgers. 3 of them in a careful, cramped hand, recording every ounce of gold that had passed through this quarry in the 2 years before the flood, every payment made and to whom, every name of every man in Ironwood Flats who had grown suddenly, unaccountably prosperous in the years since. Bartholomew Crane's name appeared on the very first page, and it appeared on nearly every page after. He wasn't just banking their money, Jonas said, his voice gone rough as gravel, turning the pages with hands that shook. He was moving federal gold through this quarry under everybody's nose, skimming shipments meant for the mint, running it here as ore, laundering it clean through his own bank. And when your brother and the other 2 found out, he didn't flood this quarry by accident, Jonas said. He murdered 3 men to bury a robbery, and he spent 15 years getting rich on their silence. There was a 4th item in the satchel, tucked beneath the ledgers where it had lain undisturbed the longest, a single letter, its ink faded but its hand still legible, addressed to no one and every one, the last testament of a foreman named Walter Combs, who had, Della realized with a chill, been her own father's old partner. If any soul ever reads this, the letter began, know that Bartholomew Crane murdered good men to keep his thieving quiet, and know that Adam Weatherby tried to stop him, and was run out of this town penniless and broken for the trying, and that I, God forgive me, was too much a coward to stand beside him. Della read her father's name in that dead man's hand and felt the whole shape of her own life rearrange itself around it. He had not simply failed here. He had been silenced here, driven off with nothing. His good name buried alongside 3 murdered men and a fortune in stolen gold. And he had spent the rest of his life carrying that unfinished truth like a stone in his chest, until it finally stopped beating. "It wasn't an accident that landed us both at this pit," she said quietly. "It was the only inheritance either of us was ever meant to have." Jonas looked at her across the lantern light, in that dry stone chamber that had kept 15 years of silence, and something passed between them that neither one had words for yet, not quite grief, not quite hope, but some third thing born out of both. "We can't carry this out alone," he said. "Crane's got the sheriff in his pocket, same as he's got half this town. The moment word gets back to him that his quarry's run dry, he'll come for what's left in it, and he won't come polite." He was more right than either of them knew. Bartholomew Crane had, in fact, already heard. Word travels fast in a small town, and word of Della Weatherby's draining sluice had reached the bank 3 days before she and Jonas ever found the tunnel. Crane had dismissed it at first as the foolish tinkering of a woman who didn't know a mining pit from a stock pond, a nuisance not worth his attention. But when his man Dutch Holloway rode out to the quarry's rim on a routine errand and reported back that the water had dropped nearly 10 feet, and that a hidden tunnel mouth had opened along the south wall, Bartholomew Crane's careful, prosperous, 15-year silence cracked straight down the middle. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who calculated, coldly and quickly, the exact size of the disaster now unfolding, and he did not waste a single hour once he understood it. "Send word to the sheriff that there's been trouble reported at the old quarry," he told Dutch, his voice flat and even, betraying nothing of the fury working just beneath it. "Send it quiet, and you go on ahead of him. Whatever that woman's found, I want it back in the ground before sundown, her included if it comes to that." Dutch Holloway was a man who did not ask questions when the pay was good, and the target was a woman working alone at the edge of town. And by the time the sun began its long slide toward the western ridge, he was already riding hard for the quarry, a coil of rope and a loaded revolver riding easy on his hip. Della and Jonas emerged from the tunnel that evening with the ledgers wrapped tight in oilcloth and a single gold bar as proof. Their plan set to ride at first light for the territorial capital and the nearest federal marshal. And it was only the sharp warning bark of Jonas's old dog, left tied near the cabin, that gave them the 10 seconds notice that likely saved both their lives. "Rider," Jonas said, going still as stone, his hand already dropping to the rifle at his shoulder. "Coming fast." There was no time to run for the cabin. There was barely time to duck behind the rusted winch tower at the quarry's edge before Dutch Holloway came into view, his horse lathered white with hard riding, his revolver already drawn and searching. "I know you're out here, little lady," he called, his voice carrying easy and cold across the emptying pit. "Boss just wants what's his. Hand it over quiet and this don't have to go ugly." Jonas's jaw tightened beside her. "It's already ugly," he murmured. "Man's been ugly 15 years." The confrontation, when it came, was short and brutal, and entirely without the clean lines of a storybook gunfight. Dutch caught sight of movement near the winch tower, and fired before either of them had drawn breath to answer him, the shot ringing off old iron, and sending Della diving flat into the mud with the ledgers clutched hard against her chest. Jonas returned fire once, forcing Dutch to wheel his horse and scramble for the cover of the collapsed cart tracks, and in that scramble the gunman's revolver went skittering from his hand into the shallow water at the quarry's edge. What followed was not a gunfight. It was a desperate, graceless struggle in ankle-deep mud and failing light. Jonas grappling with a man twice trained in violence. Della scrambling for the fallen revolver with hands slick with muck and terror. And it was only the flat, ringing blow of a rusted iron pry bar, swung by Della herself, with a strength she did not know she possessed until the moment demanded it of her, that finally dropped Dutch Holloway senseless into the mud at the water's edge. They stood over him in the deepening dusk, both of them shaking, the quarry that had kept 15 years of silence now bearing silent witness to one more piece of violence in its long history. "We can't wait for morning," Jonas said, breathing hard, already working to bind the unconscious man's hands with the rope meant for his own use. "Crane knows now. Whatever chance we had to move quiet, it's gone." There was no going back now. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and the truth they carried in that oilcloth-wrapped satchel owned them completely from that moment forward. They rode through the night, Dutch Holloway bound and slung ungently across his own saddle, the ledgers and the single gold bar packed tight in Della's satchel. They did not stop until they reached the territorial capital too hard, exhausted days later, trail-worn and desperate. But they were certain, both of them, that they were carrying something that could either save them or bury them for good. United States Marshal Everett Hale had a reputation, even out here at the ragged edge of the territory, for a kind of unbending, incorruptible integrity that men either respected deeply or feared deeply, depending on which side of the law they generally found themselves standing on. He listened to Della and Jonas's account without interruption, his weathered face giving away nothing, and when they finished, he opened the satchel himself and turned the pages of those 15-year-old ledgers with the careful, unhurried patience of a man who understood exactly how much weight a piece of paper could carry. The ink's iron gall and the papers consistent with the period, his clerk confirmed after a careful examination, and this signature here matches banking documents we've had on file from Ironwood Flats going back better than a decade. "It's authentic," Marshal Hale said, closing the ledger with a quiet finality. "And it's damning." Dutch Holloway, faced with the ledgers, the gold bar, and the marshal's flat, patient stare, did not hold out long. His confession, given over the course of a single grim afternoon, confirmed everything the ledgers implied, and a great deal they had not: the deliberate collapse of the quarry wall, the murder of 3 men including Jonas's brother Sam, and 15 years of federal gold laundered quietly through a small-town bank, while half the territory looked the other way. Marshal Hale deputized Jonas on the spot, a silent acknowledgement of the character the man had shown, and gathered a small posse of federal men he trusted without question. 3 days later, they rode into Ironwood Flats at first light. The arrests were swift and silent. There was no mercy in them, not for men who had built their comfortable lives atop 3 unmarked graves. Bartholomew Crane was taken from behind his own gleaming bank counter, his face a mask of disbelief. It cracked, slowly and then all at once, into something far more hollow as the full weight of what had been found settled over him. The town sheriff, it emerged, had been paid handsomely for 15 years of careful blindness, and he was disarmed in his own office without a shot fired. One by one, the respected men of Ironwood Flats, men who had laughed alongside Crane at the fool woman who'd bought a worthless flooded pit, were revealed as accomplices to murder and theft on a scale the territory had rarely seen. The townspeople who gathered in stunned silence along the main street that morning were the same townspeople who had laughed at Della Weatherby on the courthouse steps not 3 weeks before. None of them were laughing now. As Crane was led in chains toward the waiting prison wagon, his eyes found Della's across the street, and for one long moment, something passed between them that was not quite an apology and not quite defiance, but simply the hollow, gaping comprehension of a man who understood, too late, that the woman he'd dismissed as a fool had just erased everything he'd spent 15 years building. He was not merely defeated. He was undone, his whole careful legacy unwritten in the space of a single morning, and the town's memory of itself, of its prosperity, its respectability, its founding fathers began, quietly and irreversibly, to fracture and be rewritten. Months passed as they do, and the valley around Ironwood Flats slowly began to breathe again. The hard, dry summer finally broke into a wet autumn that greened the hills for the first time in 2 years, and the recovered federal gold, the portion that belonged, by law, to the government it had been stolen from, was put toward a new schoolhouse, and a properly qualified doctor brought out from back east, the kind of quiet, unglamorous justice that never makes it into the stories but matters more than almost anything else. On the land her father's letter had led her to, the land the whole town had once mocked her for buying, Della Weatherby began building a home. Quarry number 9 was not a pit any longer. Drained fully now, its old spring channeled into a modest, clear pond at its lowest point. The land around it had begun, slowly, to green as well. And at its northern edge, close by the old winch tower that Jonas had insisted on leaving standing, the foundation of a sturdy little house was rising, a marker of everything the ground beneath it had once tried to hide. He worked alongside her most days. The two of them fell into an easy, wordless rhythm that neither had known in a very long time, the steady tap of a hammer, the rasp of a saw, the particular quiet of two people who had earned each other's trust the hard way, and were in no hurry now to spend it carelessly. The deep grief that had lived behind Jonas's eyes since the day his brother disappeared into that black water had not vanished entirely. Some griefs never do. But it had softened, joined now by new lines at the corners of his eyes that came from something closer to peace. One evening in early autumn, as the sun slid low and gold over the western ridge, Jonas paused at his work and looked out at the distant lights of Ironwood Flats, already beginning to twinkle in the valley below. "They're saying in town the new bank's going to name a scholarship after your father," he said, "for Quarry families who lost somebody and never got a proper answer why." Della followed his gaze, her hands, once soft, now calloused and capable, resting on the timber she'd been fitting into place. "He'd have liked that better than any of the gold, I think." "You could have kept the rest of it, you know," Jonas said quietly, a question he'd clearly been holding a long while finally surfacing. "Your share of what wasn't federal property. Could have built yourself a fine house anywhere in the territory. Forgotten this town and this pit, and everything it cost you." Della looked down at her own hands, at the strength and purpose they had found in the last hard, transformative season of her life. She looked at the sturdy little home rising from the ground her father had died still fighting for, a house built not on a treasure discovered, but on a truth finally dragged up into the daylight where it belonged. "The gold was never the treasure," she said, her voice soft but sure, carrying the whole long weight of everything that had brought her to this place. "It was only the key." She smiled, a real and unguarded smile, the first of many more to come, and in the fading gold light the two of them went back to work, building their future the way honest things are always built, one nail, one plank, one patient truth at a time. The new schoolhouse held its dedication on the first cold Saturday of November. Half of Ironwood Flats turned out for it, bundled in coats against the wind, children weaving between the legs of their parents with the particular restless energy that always seems to gather wherever a crowd does. A modest brass plaque had been fixed beside the front door. Della stood before it for a long moment before the ceremony began, reading the words engraved there until she had them by heart. "In memory of Adam Weatherby, Samuel Reed, and the honest men of this valley who paid too high a price for the truth. Let this house stand for what was buried, and for what was finally brought to light. It was not restitution, not really. Nothing carved in brass or built in timber could hand her father back the years this town had cost him, could give Jonas his brother returned whole and laughing instead of a name on a plaque and a grave finally, properly marked. But it was something. It was the valley choosing, at last, to remember truly instead of conveniently. And after everything the water had swallowed and finally given back, Della found she could live with that. Marshal Hale had ridden out for the occasion himself, a gesture she had not expected from a man of his considerable duties, and he found her afterward at the edge of the gathering, watching Jonas help a cluster of children take turns ringing the schoolhouse's new bell. Crane's trial is set for the spring session, the marshal told her. Federal prosecutors tell me it's about as clean a case as they've seen in this territory in a good many years. You and Mr. Reed did this valley a service most folks never get the chance to do, Miss Weatherby. Wanted you to hear that plain, from someone whose job it is to see plainly. We didn't set out to do the valley a service, Marshal. We set out to bury our own dead properly is all. Sometimes those turn out to be the very same thing. He touched the brim of his hat to her, an old-fashioned courtesy that suited him. Your father would have been proud of the digging you did, ma'am. Most folks walk away from ground that ugly. Precious few have the sand to dig it up and see what's underneath. She thought of old Ezra then, sifting his tin of nails by the stove, telling her the water was waiting for somebody with the sand to ask it. She had not seen him since the arrests. When she asked after him at the general store the following week, the storekeeper told her, not unkindly, that Ezra had packed up his pan and his few belongings and moved on to some new creek in some new territory, chasing whatever it was that kept men like him restless. Some small part of him, she liked to think, had come to Ironwood Flats 15 years ago already knowing exactly what that black water was hiding, and had simply been waiting, patient as stone, for someone willing enough to go looking. Winter came on hard and early that year, but the little house at the edge of the old quarry stood solid against it, its foundation set deep and true into ground that had finally given up every secret it was ever going to keep. On the coldest nights, with the fire banked low and the wind pushing at the shutters, Della would sometimes walk to the window and look out at the dark shape of the old winch tower standing sentinel over the quiet pond. It had once been a 200-foot pit of black water and buried lies. She would think of her father and of Sam Reed, and of every ounce of stolen gold that had never once been worth what it cost to keep hidden. Then Jonas's hand would find hers in the dark, steady and sure, and she would turn back toward the fire, toward the only kind of wealth either of them had ever really needed, and the ground beneath their small, sturdy house would hold, solid and honest, exactly the way good ground is supposed to. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story of quiet courage and hard-won vindication. It's a reminder that the ground people tell you to walk away from is sometimes the very ground worth digging into, and that the truths this world tries hardest to drown are often the ones most worth the fight to bring back to the surface. If Della and Jonas's story moved you, we'd be honored if you'd leave a like, and let us know in the comments what you think was really the greater treasure, the gold in that hidden chamber, or the truth it had been sent down to bury. Be sure to subscribe for more tales from the forgotten corners of the frontier. We'll see you next time.